The metal walls were still warm to the touch, even 3 days after they found them. That's what the detective told Carlos Méndez as he lay in a hospital bed. Tubes running into his arms, machines monitoring the damaged rhythm of his heart. The trailer had become an oven, the detective explained, reaching temperatures that human bodies simply weren't designed to survive. For people had died in that metal box. Carlos had been one of only 3 to make it out alive. But survival, he was learning, meant more than just breathing. It meant living with the sounds that wouldn't leave his head. The desperate pounding on metal walls, the prayers that turned to gasps, the moment when voices fell silent one by one. It meant waking each night at 2:47 a.m., the exact time when Maria, the woman beside him, had stopped responding to his calls. It meant feeling phantom heat on his skin whenever he closed his eyes, as if that trailer had followed him out and would never let go. The journey had started with such hope. 2 weeks before that November morning in 2021, Carlos had been working construction in Mexico City, sending money home to Nicaragua whenever he could. But the payments were never enough. His mother needed medications the family couldn't afford. His younger brother had been accepted to university, but couldn't pay tuition. Every month brought new emergencies, new needs that his meager wages couldn't meet. When his cousin called from Houston with news of steady work and better pay, it felt like divine intervention. The cousin knew someone who knew someone, a chain of connections that led to a man called El Bujo, the Owl, who could arrange safe passage for a reasonable price. $8,000 for guaranteed delivery to Houston. The refrigerated truck would be uncomfortable, yes, but it was the safest method. Border Patrol rarely checked produce shipments thoroughly. Carlos sold everything he owned and borrowed the rest. His mother's wedding ring, pawned. His motorcycle, sold to a neighbor. Loans from friends who believed in his American dream. Every peso scraped together with a promise that he'd repay double once he reached Houston. The debt was crushing, but the future would seem worth any price. The meeting point was a warehouse outside Nuevo Laredo. He arrived at midnight as instructed, finding 6 others already waiting in the shadows. There was Maria, a 40-year-old woman from Honduras, heading to reunite with her husband. 2 brothers from Guatemala, barely out of their teens. An older man from El Salvador who said little but carried a photo of grandchildren he'd never met. A young couple from his own Nicaragua, holding hands tightly as if afraid to let go. El Bujo appeared exactly at 1 a.m., a thin man with darting eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. He collected the money first, counting each payment twice before stuffing the bills into a leather bag. Then he explained the plan with the efficiency of someone who'd given this speech countless times. The truck would cross at dawn when inspection stations were changing shifts. They'd be inside for 12 hours maximum. First stop would be a rest area outside San Antonio, where another driver would take over. He showed them the trailer, its refrigeration unit humming steadily. Inside, wooden crates of produce were stacked along the walls, leaving a narrow corridor down the middle. The hiding spot was at the front, behind a false wall that looked like more crates. The space was tight but manageable, about 8 feet by 6 feet, with just enough height to stand hunched over. The ventilation system was simple but effective, he claimed. Air holes drilled to the floor would provide circulation. The refrigeration was broken anyway, so they wouldn't freeze. If anything, it might get a bit warm, but nothing unbearable. He handed out bottles of water, 2 per person, and pointed to a bucket in the corner for necessities. 12 hours, he repeated. Maybe 14 at most. They could endure anything for 14 hours. They climbed in just before 3 a.m. The space was tighter than it had looked from outside. 8 people pressed together, shoulders touching, barely room to sit. The younger Guatemalan brother made a joke about sardines that got nervous laughter. Maria organized them efficiently, putting the couple against one wall, the brothers against another. She took a spot in the middle where she could reach everyone, already mothering the group. The false wall slid into place with a definitive click. Darkness swallowed them completely. Someone, Carlos thought was the older man, began praying softly in Spanish. Others joined in, voices mixing in the blackness. The truck's engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the metal floor. They were moving, The first hours passed slowly but manageably. They talked quietly, sharing stories of home and dreams of America. The young couple were planning to start a restaurant. The brothers wanted to send money home for their sister's medical school. Maria described her husband's apartment in Charlotte, how he'd been preparing for her arrival for 2 years. Even the quiet man opened up, talking about the grandchildren he'd only seen in photos. The border crossing was anticlimactic. They felt the truck slow, heard muffled voices outside, held their collective breath. But within minutes they were moving again, presumably now on American soil. Someone suggested a prayer of thanksgiving. Others wept quietly with relief. The hardest part was over, they thought. By hour 6, the temperature had begun climbing noticeably. What started as mild warmth became uncomfortable heat. Sweat beaded on foreheads, soaked through shirts. They rationed the water carefully, but already some bottles were empty. The air holes that seemed adequate now felt like cruel jokes, providing just enough oxygen to keep them conscious of their suffering. Hour 8 brought the first signs of real distress. The older man was struggling, his breathing labored. Maria gave him her remaining water, fanning him with her hands. The younger brother vomited into the bucket, the smell making others gag in a confined space. They pounded on the walls, hoping the driver might hear, might stop. The metal absorbed their fists without sound. By hour 10, they knew something was terribly wrong. The truck should have stopped by now. San Antonio should have come and gone. Instead, they felt the steady vibration of highway driving, the occasional shift of gears on hills. The temperature was becoming unbearable. People stripped to underwear, modesty forgotten in the face of survival. The water was long gone. The young woman was the first to collapse. Her husband held her, screaming her name, begging her to stay awake. Others tried to help, but could barely move in the cramped space. She revived briefly, mumbling about seeing her mother, then went quiet. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. There was nothing they could do but watch. Hour 12 passed with no stop. Hour 14. Time became meaningless in the darkness, measured only by increasing suffering. The heat was like a living thing, pressing against them from all sides. The metal walls radiated it, the air thick with it. Breathing became work. Thinking became impossible. Maria organized them with military efficiency born of desperation. She had everyone sit in shifts, maximizing airflow. She collected urine in empty bottles, told them to drink it if necessary. She kept talking, kept encouraging, even as her own voice cracked from dehydration. She became their anchor to sanity as reality dissolved in the heat. Sometime during what must have been the second night, though time had lost meaning in the darkness, the older man stopped responding. They felt for his pulse, found nothing. There was nowhere to move his body, no way to give him dignity. He remained propped against the wall, a silent reminder of what awaited them all. The prayers changed from pleas for rescue to preparation for death. The younger Guatemalan brother went next. His sibling held him, whispering childhood memories, singing songs their mother used to sing. When the breathing stopped, the surviving brother's keening filled the space, a sound of grief so pure it transcended language. Others wept with him, for themselves. They tried everything. Scratching at the air holes to make them bigger only bloodied their fingers. Pounding SOS patterns on the walls produced no response. The couple used their wedding rings to try to cut through metal, leaving only scratches and torn skin. One of the men tried to kick through the false wall until his feet were swollen and useless. Maria kept a mental count of the living, calling names in the darkness, demanding responses. 6, then 5, then 4. She never stopped talking, even when her words became whispers. She told them about her children, about the garden she'd planned in Charlotte, about the church she'd joined. She painted pictures with words while reality became a furnace around them. Carlos remembered fragments after that. The moment when Maria's voice finally stopped, how the silence was worse than any scream. The young woman's husband, talking to her body as if she could still hear, his own attempts to stay conscious by reciting every prayer he knew, every song, every memory that might tether him to life. He remembered the hallucinations too. His mother standing in the corner, young again, wearing the dress from his earliest memories. His brother graduating from university, cap and gown pristine. The home he'd never built, the children he'd never had. The heat created visions more real than the metal box that contained him. What he didn't remember was the truck finally stopping, the driver abandoning it at a rest stop, fleeing before anyone could connect him to the cargo. The maintenance worker who noticed the smell called the police. The first responders cutting through metal, the blast of cool air that hit bodies too dehydrated to sweat anymore. He woke in stages over several days. First came awareness of cold. Blessed, impossible cold from air conditioning and ice packs. Then pain as damaged organs struggle to function. Finally, full consciousness and the terrible clarity of survival. The detective sitting beside his bed, notebook ready, questions prepared. 3 survived out of 8. Carlos, the Nicaraguan husband, and the older Guatemalan brother. The others had died over the course of what turned out to be a 67-hour journey. The truck had never stopped, driving in shifts with multiple drivers, carrying its dying cargo across state lines. The refrigeration had been broken for months. There had never been any plan to stop in San Antonio. The investigation revealed a sophisticated operation. El Bujo was part of a network that collected payment for passages they never intended to complete safely. The trucks were deliberately chosen for their broken cooling systems. The drivers were told the cargo was already dead, just bodies being transported for burial. Multiple hands allowed everyone to claim ignorance of live humans inside. Carlos learned that Maria had survived the longest besides the 3 who made it out. Even in their statements to police, scattered and confused by trauma, all 3 survivors mentioned her voice in the darkness, her refusal to give up. She died maybe hours before rescue, having spent everything keeping others alive. Her husband in Charlotte would receive only her body and the testimony of those she'd helped survive. The young couple were found embracing, having died within minutes of each other. The grandmother who'd raised them would travel from Nicaragua to claim their bodies, selling her house to afford the transport home. Their dream of a restaurant died with them in that metal box, victims of heat and hope. The Salvadoran grandfather never got to hold those grandchildren whose photos he carried. The younger Guatemalan brother never sent money home for his sister's education. Maria never planted that garden in Charlotte. Each death represented not just an individual tragedy, but the destruction of entire family networks that had invested everything in their passage. Recovery was measured in small victories. First, keeping down water. Then solid food. Walking to the bathroom. Speaking above a whisper. The physical healing was straightforward compared to the mental aftermath. Every enclosed space triggered panic. The sound of trucks on highways sent him into tremors. Summer heat became an enemy that stalked him even in air-conditioned rooms. The other survivors faced similar struggles. The Guatemalan brother attempted suicide twice, unable to live with surviving when his sibling hadn't. The Nicaraguan husband disappeared from the hospital one night, leaving only a note saying he couldn't face his wife's family. Carlos never learned what happened to him, whether he found peace or just another form of torment. The legal system offered little justice. El Bujo had vanished, probably across the border, protected by the same networks that enabled the smuggling. The drivers claimed ignorance, thought they were hauling corpses. The company that owned the truck had already declared bankruptcy, reformed under a new name. Everyone pointed fingers at shadows while the real perpetrators counted their profits. Carlos testified to whoever would listen. Congress members seeking immigration reform. Journalists documenting the crisis. Advocacy groups fighting for change. He became a professional survivor, reliving those 67 hours for audiences who struggled to comprehend such cruelty. Some call him a hero for speaking out. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The debts remained even after the ordeal. Friends and family who'd loaned money for the passage still needed repayment. His mother still required medications. His brother's university dreams hadn't disappeared. Survival, Carlos learned, meant returning to the same problems that had driven him to that truck, only now with trauma added to poverty. He found work eventually, undocumented and vulnerable, in Houston construction like his cousin had promised. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd reached his destination, just not how anyone had planned. Every paycheck went home to Nicaragua, blood money earned through blood spilled. He lived in the shadows, afraid of deportation, but more afraid of having survived for nothing. The nightmares were specific and relentless. Always the same progression. The click of the false wall, the rising heat, Maria's voice growing weaker. He'd wake at 2:47 a.m., that moment when she'd stop responding, and spend hours convincing himself he wasn't still in the truck. Sometimes he'd call the other survivor, the Guatemalan brother, and they'd sit on the phone in silence, just breathing, proving to each other they were still alive. 3 years later, he still couldn't enter enclosed spaces without planning escape routes. Elevators were impossible. Basements sent him into panic. Even his apartment door stayed open when he was home, an invitation to thieves that felt safer than being locked in. His roommates thought him paranoid. He didn't correct them. He met other survivors of smuggling tragedies at support groups, those who'd walked deserts and found companions dead from dehydration, those who'd hidden in car engines and been burned by hot metal, those who'd trusted and been betrayed in every imaginable way. They shared a specific kind of grief, survival shadowed by those who didn't make it. The Mexican community in Houston knew his story, whispered it as warning and prayer. Mothers clutched their children tighter when he passed. Young men planning their own crossings sought him out, hoping for advice he couldn't give. What wisdom could he offer? Don't trust? Don't hope? Don't try? He'd done all three and lived when others died, and still couldn't say which choice was right. On the anniversary each year, he lit candles for the 5 who died. Maria got 2, one for her life, one for her voice that had kept him sane. He'd try to find her family, to tell them how she'd spent her last hours. But they wanted nothing to do with him. Survival, he learned, could look like betrayal to those mourning the dead. The truck still haunted the news occasionally. Politicians used it as evidence for whatever position they held. Advocates cited it in reports about smuggling deaths. Journalists called every anniversary seeking quotes. It had become a symbol divorced from reality of what happened inside. The heat, the darkness, the sound of Maria organizing people until her voice gave out. Carlos carried their names like prayer beads. Maria, the couple whose names he'd never learned, the grandfather, the young brother. 5 people who'd started the journey with the same hopes, paid the same price, trusted the same lies. The randomness of survival tortured him. Why them and not him? What cosmic arithmetic determined who lasted 67 hours and who didn't? He sent money to their families when he could, small amounts with no explanation, blood money seeking absolution. Some returned it, others cashed it silently. The young Guatemalan sister wrote once, saying she'd become a nurse instead of doctor, that she thought of her brother every time she saved a life. It was the closest thing to meaning Carlos could find in any of it. Work was its own salvation and punishment. Every beam he lifted, every floor he laid, was for those who couldn't. Houston was built on the labor of people like him, undocumented and disposable, constructing homes they'd never own for families they'd never have. The city rose on foundations of sacrifice, mortared with dreams that died in truck trailers and desert crossings. The physical scars faded, the torn fingernails from clawing at air holes, the bruises from pounding walls, the damage to organs that had overheated and somehow recovered. But phantom sensations remained. Sometimes he felt the truck moving beneath him, heard the diesel engine through metal walls. His body remembered what his mind tried to forget. He learned English at night school, sitting beside other survivors of different journeys. The teacher, well-meaning, had them write essays about their American dreams. Carlos wrote about Maria's garden, the restaurant the young couple planned, the grandfather meeting grandchildren. He wrote about dreams that died in darkness and heat, dreams that deserve remembering even if the dreamers were gone. Dating was impossible. How could he explain the nightmares, the open doors, the terror of enclosed spaces? How could he share a life haunted by ghosts? He tried once, with a woman who'd survived her own crossing, but their traumas amplified each other, creating a feedback loop of remembered horror. They parted kindly, understanding that some wounds were too deep to heal together. The other survivor, the Guatemalan brother, called less frequently as years passed. He'd moved to California, found work in agriculture, built something resembling a life. But Carlos knew he too woke at 2:47 a.m., that he too felt his brother's weight in his arms. Survival had bonded them in ways that needed no words. A brotherhood forged in darkness and sealed by those who didn't make it out. Sometimes Carlos drove past truck stops, watching the refrigerated trailers come and go. He wondered how many carried hidden cargo, how many false walls concealed desperate people trusting in lies. He thought about calling authorities, but what would he report? Suspicion? Intuition? The knowledge that El Bujo and others like him were still operating, still collecting money for journeys designed to fail? He kept Maria's memory alive in small ways, volunteering at shelters where new arrivals sought help, teaching basic English to those who reminded him of himself before the truck, warning everyone who would listen about refrigerated trailers, about broken cooling systems, about promises of easy passage that led only to metal tombs. The detention center where they kept him after the hospital felt like another kind of truck, walls closing in, air running out. They wanted him to testify, then disappear, go back to Nicaragua as if geography could cure trauma. He'd refused, slipping away into Houston's shadows, choosing undocumented life over documented death. America owed him nothing, but he owed Maria and the others everything. 5 years now since the truck stopped. 2 since the last nightmare. Progress measured in small victories. Entering an elevator. Closing his apartment door. Sitting through a movie in a dark theater. His therapist, working pro bono at a community clinic, called it integration. He called it learning to carry ghosts more quietly. The money he sent home had paid for his mother's medications, his brother's degree, a small house where his family no longer worried about rain. He'd never see any of it, trapped by his undocumented status and the trauma of another crossing. But knowing it existed, built on his survival, gave meaning to those 67 hours. The dead had purchased the living's future. On quiet nights, he still heard Maria's voice organizing them in the darkness, still felt the weight of bodies that had stopped breathing, still tasted the metallic desperation of those final hours. But now he also remembered her stories about Charlotte, her dreams of gardens, her refusal to let despair win even as her body failed. She'd been dead hours when they found them, but her voice had carried him those last miles. The truck was evidence now, sitting in some government lot, rusting in the weather. Investigators had mapped every scratch, every dent where fists had pounded. They documented the broken refrigeration unit, the inadequate air holes, the bucket that had overflowed. They reduced 67 hours of hell to measurements and photographs, missing the only detail that mattered, that people had died believing they were almost there. Carlos knew he'd never fully heal, never completely leave that metal box. Part of him would always be trapped with Maria and the others, marking time in darkness, waiting for a stop that never came. But he'd learned to live with that piece missing, to build around the absence. Survival meant accepting that some journeys never really end, that some trucks keep driving long after their wheels have stopped. He thought sometimes about finding El Bujo, confronting the man who'd sent them to die. But revenge felt hollow compared to the weight of survival. Better to spend energy on the living, on warning others, on sending money home to families who still believed in American dreams. Better be Maria's voice in the world, organizing and encouraging, refusing to let despair win. The border still called to desperate people, still promised better lives to those willing to risk everything. Trucks still roll with hidden compartments. Deserts still swallow the unprepared. Rivers still claim their toll. The mathematics of migration hadn't changed. Poverty plus hope equals whatever risk seems necessary. Carlos had survived that equation, but the variables remained constant for others. On clear mornings in Houston, when construction work started early and the city hummed with possibility, he sometimes felt what might have been hope, not for himself, that had died with Maria's voice, but for those still coming, still believing, still packing their lives into plastic bags and trusting strangers with everything. Maybe his story would save one person. Maybe his survival would mean something beyond the random cruelty of lasting longer than others in an overheated box. The truck would never stop for those who died. Texas had come and gone while they gasped in darkness, while Maria spent her last words keeping spirits alive. But Carlos had emerged somehow, damaged but breathing, carrying their stories into a world that preferred not to hear them. He was their stop now, their arrival, their witness to journeys that ended nowhere but deserved remembering everywhere. In his wallet, he carried a list: Maria from Honduras, the unnamed couple from Nicaragua, the grandfather from El Salvador, the young brother from Guatemala. 5 names representing 5,000 dreams, 5 million dreams, all the dreams that died in trucks and deserts and rivers while searching for something better than what poverty offered. He was their memory now, their voice, their refusal to disappear completely into statistics and silence. The truck never stopped in Texas, but Carlos had, somehow, survived to tell why it should have. And maybe, in a world that turned away from such stories, that was the only arrival that mattered. The chance to say their names, to insist they lived, to warn others that some journeys cost more than money and delivered less than promised. Maybe survival meant nothing more or less than that. Carrying the dead forward, one story at a time, one name at a time, one memory of Maria's voice organizing people in the darkness, refusing to let them die unwitnessed or forgotten.